On Saturday, the presumptive Republican presidential nominee Mitt Romney will deliver the commencement address at Liberty University, the nation's largest evangelical school. The move is aimed at solidifying his support among evangelicals, especially after President Obama's endorsement of same-sex marriage. But according to my next guest, Governor Romney may actually be fighting against a growing trend. He's found that 52% of young evangelicals between the ages of 18 and 35 actually support some form of same-sex unions. Joining us now is author of A Faith of Our Own, Following Jesus Beyond the Culture Wars, Jonathan Merritt. Jonathan, thank you for coming in. Fascinating new twist on what many of us had improperly presumed to be a unified voting bloc without any of the fissures that we see in the rest of society. Explain what you found.
Yeah, well, what I've seen is that the next generation of Christians differs substantially from the previous generation. They're not resonating with the religious right, not even the religious left. And I think you're seeing really at least three shifts. There's a shift from being largely a partisan movement to being more independent. There's a shift from being focused on a narrow agenda to a broader one. And then there's a shift from really relying on divisive rhetoric to now really wanting to use civil dialogue when we discuss these issues in the public square.
That is a very affirmative three sets of shifts. And I say that not as a partisan, but just in terms of the nature of our political discourse. But it also, I think, mirrors what is happening across the rest of society. In other words, the evangelical folks under 35 are looking more similar to non-evangelicals below the age of 35 than their seniors.
Yeah, well, in some ways they are, and in other ways they aren't. For example, you've not seen a shift with them on life issues, for example.
By which you mean?
Well, by abortion issues. So actually they are more pro-life statistically than their parents' generation was. So they're shifting on things like same-sex unions. They're not shifting when it comes to issues like abortion. And so you're getting now a mixed bag. What I often tell people is we're not seeing the rise of the evangelical left or the evangelical right. You're seeing now the evangelical stuck in the middle.
And I'm trying to square the division on issues of choice and abortion on the one hand versus same-sex issues. I'm trying to see an ideological thread that would say we're open-minded and willing to see, two folks getting together, men or women, and yet not on the issue of choice. How do you make sense of that as intellectually?
Well, the statistic that I think makes sense of this comes down to relationships. So young evangelicals 18 to 35 are actually twice as likely as their parents' generation to have a close friend who's gay. And so being in these relationships, they're finding that it's a lot easier to fight a faceless agenda than it is to war against a friend. And being in these relationships has totally changed the discussion, I think.
And so to a certain extent, because individuals who are gay are now more open about it, there is just a greater likelihood that all of us have friends, close friends who are gay, and therefore the sort of bias and easy prejudice that existed with prior generations, our seniors, are harder to maintain.
Well, and they're more willing to form relationships with these individuals. What you're finding is where the last generation wanted to turn back the tide of the shifts we were finding in culture as a result of the American Cultural Revolution. This generation has come of age in a different time, and they're quite comfortable with living in a world that's postmodern and pluralistic.
Right. Fascinating. Now, how is the older generation of senior evangelical leadership dealing with your conclusions and what you're essentially projecting forward will be a much more diverse, more fractious evangelical voting bloc?
Yeah, I'm seeing two responses from sort of your old guard evangelical leadership. The first one is just total dismissal. We don't want to listen to this.
Denial.
We don't want to hear from this. Power, as long as we can have it, we'll take it. Then there's another group, and I've even seen this from, there was a blog post about some comments I made on the Family Research Council blog. And it's like, we've been with you all along. Of course we want a nonpartisan movement. Of course we want to be civil, as if they're not on record for the last 20 years about some of these things. And so it's really fascinating now, as power slips through the fingers of some of these old guard evangelicals, to see the way that they're reacting.
Now, look, we could spend hours talking about these really fascinating substantive issues. I want to come back to politics for a moment, though.
Yes.
Is Mitt Romney perhaps misjudging some of what he hopes will be an evangelical base? And should he read your book and say, wait a minute, I've got to be a bit more open-minded on the issue of same-sex marriage in particular?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, I actually like Mitt Romney. I think he's a seems like a really good guy. But what I'm seeing in this campaign with this move of doing the commencement address at Liberty University is it's like his campaign has adopted the tactics of the GOP 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
30 years ago, the GOP would march down to Pat Robertson's office and go on CBN, or they would march down to Lynchburg, Virginia, and gather up some folks in front of a camera in Lynchburg, Virginia. But it is a misjudging of this generation because they're not listening to those leaders anymore. We saw it in South Carolina, where 150 evangelical leaders in Texas got together and said, vote for Rick Santorum. And then 65% of them decided to vote either for the Mormon candidate or the thrice married Roman Catholic over the candidate that their leaders suggested. So this generation is not listening to these leaders anymore.
Would seem to me, therefore, there's a new leadership that's going to emerge that will be more in sync with the folks who are in the group you're talking about.
Well, I certainly hope so. I think we need a more centrist, more civil, nonpartisan leadership among evangelicals in America if we're going to save this faith in the United States.
That, I think, applies to our politics generally. Come back to fascinating conversation and amazing conclusions. Jonathan Merritt, author of A Faith of Our Own, Following Jesus Beyond the Culture Wars. Thank you for your time.